Hello, Dr. Rawlette. Nice to meet you. So, if you're ready, then I'm ready.
All right, let's do it.
All right, Dr. Rawlette, I would like to introduce you first. You got your doctoral degree in philosophy. You are a researcher and you have written multiple books about consciousness, parapsychology, and spirituality. Your most recent one is being called Beyond Death, the Best Evidence for the Survival of Consciousness. It is an award-winning essay with a vast variety of evidence from doctors, scientists, and other highly qualified investigators. I'm very excited to talk to you about this book today.
Good. I'm really excited to talk to you.
Thank
Thanks
you
for having me on the show.
Dr. Rawlette, the cases of evidence in your book are divided in two categories. There is the third person evidence for survival, and there is the first person evidence for survival. Would you please explain the difference between these two?
Sure. So the third person evidence is evidence that's coming from somebody who is still alive, but who is experiencing some sort of phenomenon that seems to indicate communication from somebody who has passed on. So examples of that might be seeing an apparition of someone, or maybe you have a dream of somebody who has passed on, or even mediumship would be an example of third person phenomena, poltergeists, and there are a few other examples. But then first person phenomena are the experiences of people who themselves have experienced dying and crossing to the other side, as we like to put it. So this might be near-death experiences. So those are actually cases of people who are provisionally dead. They're not permanently dead because they come back and they tell us about it. But then you also have, children who have memories of having lived before in a different body, and that body did die permanently. And they remember not only their life in that other body, but then many of them remember being conscious after the death of that previous body in sort of an intermission state where they don't have a body, but they're still aware of being themselves and even of interacting with other people. So that's the first person side. And I think both of these are really important to understanding the evidence for survival.
Yes, the cases in your book are very, very impressive. Now, do you have some kind of especially fascinating case about the third person phenomena that you would like to share with us?
So, yeah, okay. So here's a really interesting one because this sort of crosses the boundaries of two different kinds of third person phenomena. So in this case, there was a young woman who was staying at her aunt's house. And her aunt's house was known to be haunted. Apparently, people had seen repeatedly an apparition in this house, and it's specifically in one room. So one night, this girl is staying with her aunt, and she ends up having to sleep in the haunted bedroom. So she's asleep there. She's actually locked the door, but she wakes up in the middle of the night, and there's someone in her room. It looks somebody who's dressed like a servant. And this figure comes over to her bed and sort of leans down over her bed and acts like it's trying to speak to her, but there's no sound that comes out. And she's a bit frightened, so she pulls the covers over her head, and by the time she takes them down, the apparition has disappeared. So it was sometime later, weeks, maybe months later, she was in a completely different location. She was hanging out with a friend of hers, and her friend was into like spirit communication. I don't know if they were doing like table tipping, because this was in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So it may have been table tipping. It might have been something more like a Ouija board. But they were doing some kind of spirit communication, and this girl decided to join in. And so they start getting messages from a spirit who says that her name is Sarah Clark, which doesn't mean anything to this woman, but she says she's Sarah Clark. And then she starts explaining that she used to be a servant in her aunt's household, some like 40 years beforehand. And she says that she appeared to this young woman in the bedroom of the house. And that the reason she had been doing this and appearing to her and appearing to other people is that while she worked there, she had actually stolen some things from the aunt's family, including a silver sugar bowl she mentioned. And I think she mentioned another item or two that was specific. She said she'd stolen these things and she wanted to come back and ask for forgiveness.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
So this young woman, I mean, she didn't really know whether this was true or not. She had never heard of this person named Sarah Clark, but later she went back to her aunt and she said, you know, I got this communication from this person named Sarah Clark. Does that mean anything to you? And the aunt said, yes, indeed. Sarah Clark used to be a servant in our household, but she seemed very trustworthy. We never suspected her of stealing, but it is true that there were some objects that disappeared while she was working for us, including a silver sugar bowl.
Wow.
And so, so the aunt said, you know, I don't know whether she stole those things or not, but if she did, I am happy to forgive her. You know, she can move on. She doesn't need to worry about that anymore. And from that time on, nobody saw the apparition anymore in the bedroom. The bedroom was no longer haunted.
Mm-hmm.
So so you've got this interlacing between the sort of mediumship things, but also these apparitions. And one of the things that's fascinating about this case, not just the fact that some specific details were given that were then verifiable by the aunt, but also that it shows that these apparitions that a lot of people have experienced, and often, you know, they don't speak. Sometimes they do, but often they don't. These apparitions aren't just sort of like mechanical leftover holograms of, you know, something that happened in the past, that at least in some cases, they're actually the consciousness of somebody who's trying to accomplish something. They're coming there with a goal because there's something on their mind that they want to have resolved, and they keep coming there until somehow they're able to get their message through and get that taken care of. And then the phenomenon disappears.
Mm-hmm. They have found their peace, so to speak.
Yeah.
Wow. Very interesting. It makes one want to do things right from the very beginning, because it doesn't end probably with death, right?
Yeah. You don't want to be having to hang around and figure out, you know, all the people that you might have hurt during your life and figure out how to communicate with them. And
but isn't it beautiful that we already know that it might not end? So now we have still the chance and the time to fix things and clear things up.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Great. Well, speaking of favorite cases, is there any first person evidence or phenomenon that is your favorite case or that you remember specifically?
Yeah, there's a lot here, because for me, the first person stuff is so important, and often I feel like it gets a little bit lost in the literature. There are a lot of people who've written about evidence for life after death, and they'll mention near-death experiences, and they might, you know, mention memories of previous lives, but it seems like they really focus on apparitions and mediumship, which I think is kind of funny, because the first person accounts provide this extra level of corroboration to show that, yes, these are not just illusions of some kind of after-death contact. There's really this first-person awareness. And, so I'm getting to my favorite case. So my favorite group of cases are the ones where you have people who remember not only living previous lives, not only remembering being alive after they died in that previous body, but they remember communicating with people that they left behind in their previous life.
Okay, very interesting.
Yes. So we don't have a whole lot of these cases, at least not in the, you know, verified investigated literature. But we have enough of them to be very suggestive and to be worth a lot more investigation. So favorite one, well, let's go with the dream case. So So in this case, this happened in Southeast Asia. I forget exactly which country it was, but this was a case that was investigated by Ian Stevenson, who anybody who knows anything about reincarnation research knows who he is. He did so much work in this area. So this was one of his very carefully investigated cases. And in this particular case, he was investigating a young boy who had detailed memories of a previous life with somebody who I don't think was related to his family at all. Because a lot of times people are reincarnated within the same family, but in this case, it was somebody that was not, he wasn't reincarnating as the child of his own daughter or son or whatever. He remembered a life being in a strange family, and using the details that this boy gave, Ian Stevenson was able to track down who this family was. Now, one of the things that the boy remembered was that after he had died, he had come to his widow in a dream. And he remembered specifically, he said, I went to her in a dream and I told her where she could find some money that I had left. He specifically said a 5 chop note that was in a basket and covered with a white handkerchief. There were a few little details in there. He said, I came to her in a dream, I told her where the money was. And the little boy wanted to know if that woman that he had previously been married to remembered having the dream. So Ian Stevenson asked her, and she indeed remembered her husband coming to her after his death, telling her about a 5 chop note in a basket with a white handkerchief. And she had gone to the basket and she had found the money, which wasn't a lot of money, like it was just a few dollars or something. But for her, it was more an emotional confirmation that her husband was still alive. And here we have confirmation that apparently her husband was now alive in the body of this young boy and starting a whole new existence.
Wow, that is so fascinating. And also it is very interesting that there doesn't need to be much time between these reincarnations, because oftentimes we don't know, is it a year, is it 10, is it 100? But apparently it doesn't need to be a lot.
No, and it seems to vary between cultures, actually. So there are some cultures, actually the Druze in Lebanon, their religious belief is that reincarnation happens at the exact moment of death in the previous life. So the next child is going to be born exactly when the other person dies. And in the cases that Stevenson investigated in Lebanon, it wasn't always an exact timing, but it usually was a very short intermission period, as they call it. So that may explain why the Druze believe that it happens immediately, because at least in their culture, it does seem to happen very quickly. But then when you go to other countries, you'll sometimes find a much longer time period. It just really varies. Some cultures, it's much more common for children to reincarnate within the same family. So you'll often see children coming back as their own grandchildren. Or great grandchildren. So usually you're about 2 generations later. And also, I think if I'm remembering correctly, the length of the intermission period seems to be correlated with the manner in which the person died. Say that since I'm not totally sure, but I seem to remember that if it was a violent death, that often the intermission period is a lot shorter. So.
Interesting.
But yeah, there are starting to be a lot of interesting statistical comparisons between cultures as more and more studies of these cases are done.
Wow. Well, now's the big question. How would you explain those phenomena? I mean, apparitions, mediumship, how is that possible? What is your opinion on that?
Yeah. Well, I think it's possible because ultimately, consciousness has a much more important place in the nature of reality than our culture recognizes right now. So for a few hundred years, we've, at least within, the intellectual circles of our culture, we've had this idea that consciousness is really created by the brain, or it's, it's always correlated with the brain. So if you don't have a working brain anymore, you don't have consciousness. Mm-hmm. And of course, that does make it a very big puzzle, how it would be possible for someone to still be conscious after their body is dead and their brain is not working anymore. But partly because of these sorts of cases that we've been talking about, partly because of near-death experiences, which are really so common. I mean, we've got somewhere between 5 and 15% of the general population that has experienced a near-death experience. Wow. So not just of people who, have come close to death, but this is anybody. You walk up to anybody, you have a 5 to 15% chance that person has had a near-death experience. So partly due to how ubiquitous those experiences are, more people are starting to examine the possibility that our consciousness is not dependent on the brain, and to think about, well, what is wrong with our current paradigm, and how should we understand how the brain and consciousness interrelate with one another? And the best way that I've been able to formulate for myself, not that I came up with this theory on my own, I mean, but of all of the theories that I've, heard people talk about and that I've thought through myself, I think the most explanatory one is one that says that consciousness is the most basic reality that we have in our world. And the physical world is something that is in consciousness, in the way that, when you have a dream, you're dreaming at night, the place where you are in your dream, you don't think of it as, a physical place that's going to exist out somewhere. Mm-hmm. It's somehow just in your mind. Well, the idea is that even this physical world that we're all sharing, this physical experience in right now, is a world like that. It's a world that ultimately is inside mind. It's created by the experiences that all of us are having as conscious beings. And we've somehow coordinated our experiences of this world so that we can interact in it. But ultimately, it's not the ultimate reality. It's some little piece of our consciousness that's chosen to have this particular experience right now. Mm-hmm. One analogy that I like to use a lot too is the idea that physical reality is like a video game that you're like you're sitting in your living room, especially if you're a kid, like you get really into these video games and you just start, you're immersed in that world and you're not worried about anything except getting to the next level. So you're very focused on that. So for you in that moment, it's like nothing else exists. But when the video game is over, or, your mom turns off the thing because it's time to do something besides play video games, then suddenly you sort of like snap out of this trance that you were in doing the video games, and you realize that the whole time you've been sitting in your living room, and there's all these other people around, and there's all this other stuff that's going on around you. I think dying is sort of like that. It's like the video game suddenly gets turned off. Yeah. And we realize that there's so much more to who we are and to where we are than we could tell when we were so focused on getting to that next level in the game.
That is a really nice metaphor. And it makes me remember one of the things that Dr. Eben Alexander said in one of our previous interviews. He said that during his near-death experience, he felt like everything is so vivid and clear, especially the sounds and the colors, that the physical life in comparison seemed like a dream state. And that is exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, I think it's, I haven't had a near-death experience, but from what people have said like this, that it's, it's realer than real. It's so much more vivid. There are things there that you don't even have words for to explain. The video game analogy does seem to work really well, because if you've been focused on a video screen all this time, and then you start like looking at the real world, like, wow, the resolution is great. Like, this is super HD.
Yeah, that's a good one.
And you've been in a video game where all you have is the visual input and you have the sound of it. But then when you snap out of the video game, suddenly you realize you have all these other senses too. You can smell things, you can touch things, all this stuff that you couldn't do in the game because it was just a very narrow sort of reality. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's true. It does tie in with that.
Also, it's kind of funny that the video game in this case would be two-dimensional. We live in the third dimension, and then there may be even higher dimensions. So we kind of snap into it.
Right. Yeah. If you can imagine, like, if you tried to explain to someone inside the video game, like you were asking the question, well, how is it possible that our consciousness goes on after death? If you were somehow interacting with somebody in the video game and they were like, well, how is it possible that when your avatar dies, like you're still going to be alive? Or, I mean, where would you even be alive? You can't explain to somebody inside that setting where the living room is. Like it doesn't have a location inside the video game world. It's just, a whole other dimension.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Rawlette, you have just mentioned that you personally did not have any near-death experiences yourself, but did you experience some other paranormal phenomenon, or did you have an out-of-body experience yourself, or altered states of consciousness, something that has shaped your worldview?
Well, I have not ever had an out-of-body experience that I can remember. I tell people I'm not really a very psychic person, but I do have some psychic experiences, and they tend to happen in the dream state. So I don't know that I ever am out of my body or what have you, but I have had a lot of dreams that bring me accurate information about, often about other people's lives or about something that's going to happen to me in the future. But to be totally honest, it wasn't those sorts of experiences that got me into studying this field or that made me take it seriously. That sort of came later. I was really pretty skeptical about these sorts of phenomena until, I don't know, I guess I was about in my late 20s. But at that time, I started experiencing coincidences or synchronicities. Mm-hmm. So some of them were like pretty small things, and you kind of look at them and be like, well, that might just be chance. I don't know if that's really anything or not, but it would sort of stay in the back of my mind. And then I started experiencing some really blatant ones. And the biggest one that was a turning point for me, that is ultimately what led me to write my first book in parapsychology, The Source and Significance of Coincidences, happened back in 2015, when I was going through a time when I had broken up with an ex of mine, somebody I had been engaged to be married to years ago in France. He was French, and we had fallen out of touch. I had, moved on and married someone else. He had married someone else. But a few years after I got married, he was very much on my mind. And I was just like wondering, like, was he happy? I wanted to tell him like I was happy with my life. But I didn't feel like being married that I could communicate with him. I didn't feel comfortable doing that with my husband. So I was thinking about him so much. It was really like constantly in my thoughts. And finally, one day I was out with some friends. We were in Pennsylvania at the time, and we were in an unfamiliar area. So we were looking for a grocery store, and we needed help from our phones to find where the grocery store was. And at the time, my friend was driving the car that we were in. And so she asked her phone to find us the nearest grocery stores. And then because she was driving, she handed me the phone to look at the map and decide where we were going to go. So she hands me the phone. It has a list of grocery stores in Pennsylvania near us. And I have never touched this phone before in my life. And also keep in mind, this was in 2015 before our phones were like listening in on our conversations all the time. So it wasn't, today this would be a little bit less jarring, I think, but at the time, that sort of advertising targeting wasn't happening. So she gives me the phone. It's got this list of grocery stores in Pennsylvania, and I just hit one button. I hit map because I wanted to see those grocery stores on a map. So when it loads, it's not showing me stores in Pennsylvania anymore. It is showing me 5 French grocery stores, and they're all connected to town names that sound French to me. I don't recognize any of them except one, the town of Carré, and I couldn't remember where in France that was exactly, but I was like, now it's showing me grocery stores in France. This is really strange. And I asked my friend, like, what's going on? I don't get this. And she said, I don't know. I've never used my phone to look up anything in France. We hadn't even been talking about France in the car. I mean, this was not a subject of conversation that day, but somehow it showed me these towns. So when I got home a couple days later, I Googled the name of the town that I remembered, Carré, from the map. And it turned out that it was in Brittany, which was the region where my ex lived, which was very startling. And when I saw that, I had this immediate conviction, and maybe this is showing that I am a tiny bit psychic, I don't know. But when I saw that, I had this immediate conviction that if it was showing me a town in Brittany, that maybe, or that it had to be showing me where my ex was on that day. So I didn't really know how to find that out, but I just like typed his name and the date into Google and thought, well, maybe somehow miraculously it will tell me where he was then. And lo and behold, it brought up a page from his blog that announced some events he was going to be attending. He's also a writer, so some events that he was going to be attending that month. And one of them was on the date of that event with the GPS, and was taking place 2 miles from that grocery store that I had seen on my phone in Cali. So that's when I said, I don't think this is chance.
Yeah.
Something else is going on. Mm-hmm. And I won't go through the whole rest of the story, but the moral of it is that event, that huge coincidence, in quotes, eventually led me to actually write to my ex, and to, like, I talked to my husband first and worked that out, and then I wrote to my ex, and we did sort of, just update each other on where we were in our lives. And it turned out that he had just had his first child just a few days after that event happened. So it was the perfect time to reconnect.
Oh, wow.
Kind of, to share that next stage in each of our lives. So it turned out to be this very healing, transforming experience. And it was all started off by that really crazy thing that happened with the phone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know what you mean. Sometimes circumstances in life, they align so perfectly in a miraculous way that one thinks there must be something else. Like there must be some influence from other levels or a higher power, something else, because sometimes even the smallest decision that we make turns out to be a life changer, and that just can't be by chance.
Yeah. Or, you're at a time in your life where you feel like something needs to change. You need to go in a new direction, maybe professionally, like you need a new job, and you really have no idea where to look for this. I'm saying this has happened to me, but I imagine it's happened to a lot of people. And then something will just appear, like somebody will just call you on the phone and say, you wouldn't be interested in doing such and such thing. Like, well, actually, yeah, that's exactly the kind of thing that I would like to do. So many times I've had things just kind of fall out of the sky like that, that turned out to be life-changing and just such gifts. And yeah, if it happens once or twice, then, maybe that's chance, but it's happened so many times in my life. And that's part of why I wrote the first book, The Source and Significance of Coincidences, because I wanted to share a lot of stories that people have about this, but also put it in the context of all of these other phenomena that people experience. So all of this evidence for survival from the Beyond Death book, it's not only important for people to understand that, yeah, apparitions provide evidence for life after death, dreams provide evidence for life after death, but also when they experience things like synchronicities, because this is actually a very common way in which people seem to have contact with their deceased loved ones. And it can sometimes seem like chance, especially if you've never really had any other experience like this in life. But when you look at that coincidence through the lens of all of this other evidence that there is that our consciousness does go on, it seems to be much more plausible that those coincidences are actually not just coincidences, but they really are directed by your loved one who's trying to communicate something to you.
Beautiful. Dr. Rawlette, you have mentioned the word psychic a few times. Do you think it is possible to develop, or should I rather say unlock, one's own psychic abilities? And if so, how could one do that?
I do think it's possible. And I think the first thing that's important is to pay more attention to it, because the more seriously you take the synchronicities in your life, the more seriously you take your dreams, whatever little snippets you get of something that seems intuitive. Also, I mean, waking intuition. So like in that example I was giving of the thing with the GPS on the phone, when I was looking into it, I was like, oh, I think this is what's going to happen. And sometimes we'll get those intuitions. And I think it's really important to follow up on them and investigate and see, well, is that right or not? Because sometimes you will be right. And sometimes you realize that intuition was just your imagination. But it's only by testing them out and seeing which ones are accurate and which ones aren't that you start to understand the difference in the feeling between true intuitive information and your imagination at work. So pay more attention, follow up on the information that you do feel like you're getting, and test it and see if it's true or not. And then certainly there are a lot of programs that have been developed by people who are much more advanced in their intuitive capacities than I am. A lot of them recommend meditation. A lot of them recommend writing down your dreams. That is something that I do and have found very useful, is writing down my dreams every morning, whether I think that they're significant or not. Like sometimes it seems like, well, that's just wacky. I don't see how that could mean anything. But I write it down while I'm still sort of half asleep. And then later in the day or later in the week, I go back and I discover, well, actually, that seems really significant. And sometimes, because I've recorded specific details, I'll then be able to see that I experienced something later that correlates with what I had written down.
Very interesting.
Yeah, if you're not keeping a record, you're very likely to overlook some of the ways in which you are already psychic or intuitive.
Beautiful. Dr. Rawlette, in what way did researching parapsychology and working a lot with consciousness affected your life over the years?
That's a great question. I really like that. I mean, aside from, completely changing my professional trajectory and sending me into writing all these books, and just being an amazing subject I just love investigating this stuff. I love learning more. And so it has changed my life because it's made me much more, it's helped me marvel at the world, where I just feel like every day I learn something new and fascinating about existence. And that's been so enriching. But I think on a more personal level, that it has made me more trusting. Because I'm a very analytical person. And I think, in my personal life, I don't have, terrible anxiety, but I get anxious about, things. I'm trying to figure out how to avoid problems in my life, and, constantly thinking about, well, what can I do better to make sure that my life is okay in the coming days and weeks. So very focused on sort of making the best possible decisions and controlling every little thing about my life that I can. And learning that there are these other beings, interacting with me and producing these coincidences and lining things up in my life the way that they're supposed to, has helped me relax a lot and helped me realize that, when I look back at the path that I have followed and the good things that have come into my life professionally and personally, yes, I mean, my hard work, I think, is one ingredient there, but there's this other ingredient that is not something that I created. Mm-hmm. These opportunities were given to me. These people were brought into my life at the right time, to help me along my way. And looking at that past and looking at the way this has happened for so many other people and other people who have had the privilege of a near-death experience or an out-of-body experience where they're actually able to interact with these entities that have helped them. Mm-hmm. Reading those stories helps me to trust even more and to just to let go of some of that need to control and to say, yeah, I mean, I should make good decisions, but I don't need to wear myself out going through every possible, way that things could turn out and mm-hmm. Holding on to things so tightly. Like, you can just approach life with a much more open hand and be excited about receiving whatever it is that comes into my life.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. What kind of thoughts did you have while writing the book and collecting all the data? Did you maybe receive any new insights during the process?
I think probably the thing that was the most surprising to me, the more I investigated this, because I had done a lot of investigation of the survival literature before, but working on this book in particular, I was really surprised to see so many cases of out-of-body experiences of living people who appeared to other people as apparitions. Mm-hmm. So I had known some about this before, but it was really interesting to see how many detailed cases there were where somebody remembered going out of body. They remembered visiting a friend, say, or a family member, having a conversation with them. And they would remember that, the details of it and where they were. And then later they would, back in their body, back in physical life, they would meet up with that person, and that person would have experienced them appearing as an apparition to them. They would remember the same things being discussed in a conversation. They remember the same location. So I feel like this really connects all of this afterlife research to the lives that we live right here, because it shows that even while we're in this body, our consciousness is not limited by that body. Maybe, on an everyday basis, yeah, it somewhat is. But if we can find a way into that larger state of consciousness, we can actually engage in some of those same behaviors that those who've passed on engage in. We can appear to others, to our loved ones who, are maybe thousands of miles away, and we can't see them on a regular basis, but we can psychically show up and talk to them. It doesn't happen that often. And there are certain people who seem to have more of a knack for it than others. And it's happened to multiple times. For most of us, I think it tends to happen only in situations of really great need. When we're going through a crisis, or we have particularly strong emotional need to connect with that person. Somehow that need connects us to that larger consciousness and our greater capacities for these things. But to know that we don't have to wait until we die to connect with that larger consciousness, that we can access it and use it, now, I think is a great discovery.
That is a great insight. Awesome. Many people are familiar with the term past life, and obviously there are people who have memories of previous lives, but I feel like there is something which is not as commonly known, and this is memories of the intermission period between lives. Would you like to elaborate on that maybe?
Yes, absolutely, because that's another really important thing that does get overlooked, which is a real shame. So for a long time, when people have discussed memories of previous lives, they have also discussed this skeptical hypothesis that, well, maybe it's not really the consciousness of the previous person that's now reincarnated, but maybe this child is just sort of psychically connecting with that person, or connecting with the past and that person's past consciousness. And so they're just sort of accessing dead memory. It's not really that person alive still. It's just that they can remember some of the things that happened to them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I think it's so important that we realize that the literature of past life memories is full of these memories of the intermission period. It's not just that children are somehow connecting to somebody's past memories of their life, because they not only experience the death, they experience what happens after it. They experience a lot of the same things that near-death experiencers experience. So they will have that experience of floating out of their body, the experience of hanging out around their funeral or around their mourning family. They'll see what's going on. Sometimes they're trying to interact with their family, but they don't manage to get through in any way. It's like their voice just isn't heard.
Mm-hmm.
The same way that a lot of near-death experiencers report. At least 2 cases where children with a past life memory actually remember appearing as an apparition to the loved ones that they left behind. Mm-hmm. So they actually managed to make themselves visible in some way, and those people remember them having done that. Mm-hmm. So those are very important cases.
Wow.
That reciprocal memory of the event. Then they will have, a lot of times they'll have memories of interacting with other deceased people on the other side. Then, and this usually it's in this order, but not necessarily. You also have children remembering seeing things that were happening in the life of their future family. Mm-hmm. So sometimes it's events that happened while their mother is pregnant with them, but some children will remember things that happened during the childhood of their parents. They've seen, the house that their mom grew up in, or they'll see some other event early in their parents' lives, or there are several cases of children actually witnessing their conception. And they'll finally, usually once they're adults, they'll go to their parents and be like, I've got this memory of, of this. So one funny case, I think this woman was in her 20s by the time she talked to her mom about this, but she was like, I had this memory of Dad coming home from work one day for lunch and him being like, let's go in the bathroom. And you guys went in the bathroom and you told Dad that you needed to put in your diaphragm. And he said, no, don't worry about it. And her mom was like, yeah, that did happen. That was the one time I didn't use my diaphragm. And here you are. Mm-hmm. So they tend to see a lot of details about how these things happened.
I think I even remember that this girl thought, now is my chance. I can kind of like step into it.
Yes, you're right. Yeah. When she heard the dad say, you don't have to put in your diaphragm. She's like, oh, okay, I got to go now.
Yeah. Isn't that crazy? Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So there's this thought process of how you get into the physical. How are you going to open the door in order for yourself to be reincarnated into this family? There's lots of stories about the children specifically choosing their parents and like sort of watching them and then deciding, yes, that's the family that I want to be a part of.
Yeah, which would make sense.
Yeah. And some of them actually talk about having some help, like they have some sort of, guide, or, some will say that it's God or Jesus, like helping them make the choice and decide what's the best family.
Yeah, I mean, maybe this is getting too spiritual now, but my thought is here, well, if you have a specific goal or a lesson to learn, then of course you got to look for the right circumstances which will help achieve you this goal. And then it would make sense to pick the right environment, the right parents and country and so forth.
I know some people, in the reincarnation research, and even people who research the intermission memories, they're a little bit hesitant to talk about this idea of life planning because they feel like there's not enough like hard evidence, like there's not enough really young children that give detailed accounts of choosing their life for a specific purpose or what have you. But I've come across so many adults who still have pre-birth memories of having planned their life in some way, or near-death experiencers who during their near-death experience remembering that there is a specific purpose. And many times that's why they decide to go back to their life, because they haven't completed whatever that purpose or mission was that they had set for themselves. So yeah, it's not super obvious in the literature on children's intermission memories, at least right now, because really that research is in its infancy. But I think there's enough out there throughout the parapsychological literature to make it seem very plausible that we do plan our lives with a specific goal in mind.
Mm-hmm. There's one case I have found extremely interesting. You have written about it in your book regarding intermission memories. This one was reported by Elizabeth and Neil Carman in their book Cosmic Cradle, and it was about a little girl who remembered being miscarried.
Yeah.
Maybe you can recall this case.
Yeah. I'm trying to think where to start this description, because there are a lot of different elements of this case.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of the very first memory that she told her mom. She told her mom that she had been in her tummy before. That time she died. But then when she was in the second time, she came out like a zipper. And she had actually been born by C-section. When she came to term. So that seemed like a pretty accurate description of a C-section. And then a few years later than that, when she was 7 or 8, she was driving with her mom in a neighborhood that they hadn't visited before, apparently. And the little girl noticed this building, just sort of a nondescript building. And she said, "Oh, Mommy, I've been in there before. That was the building that I was in back when I died," or something. Like, not that she had died there, but in that previous existence, she had been in that building. And her mom confirmed that was where she had gone to the doctor when she had her first pregnancy, the one that she lost. Mm-hmm. So those were the first clues. But this girl retained memories of this even into adulthood, because by the time Neil and Elizabeth Carman wrote their book, they were actually able to interview this young woman, and she was in her 20s, and she was able to give them more details about her memories. And one of the things that she said she remembered was actually the moment of the miscarriage, which happened pretty early on in the pregnancy. I think, she was an embryo only a few inches long or so. But she remembered falling out of her mom's body in the shower and like hitting the drain and then sort of going into the drain. And she said that's when the experience kind of cut off. And she also remembered that her mom and dad, and this was something she told her mom when she was young as well. She remembered that her mom and dad had had an argument because her mom thought, she just had a feeling that the baby was going to be a boy. And so the mom and dad started talking about the circumcision question, and they were apparently on opposite ends of this debate, and really strongly so. And the girl said that she somehow was aware of what they were arguing about, and she knew that they would get divorced over the circumcision question. And that, so she decided to leave and come back as a girl, so that wouldn't even be an issue.
Yeah, because she needed them to be together for her experience.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So again, that idea of the planning. Now I wonder why somebody didn't help her realize beforehand that it would probably be good for her to be a girl, and sort of finesse that and make sure she was a girl in the first place. But for whatever reason, it's not a perfect process. You can't always foresee everything, but and we had free will. So it may not have been clear until the argument started to happen that this was really going to be
exactly
a deal breaker for them.
And you know, when I wrote this case, I thought, wow, this could be an important insight for mothers or parents who had miscarriages, because that would implicate that it is the choice of the soul, probably. So it has nothing to do with them. It is nobody's fault. It may take away shame and pain once we realize that there might be free will in this case. Yeah,
absolutely. One other element from that case along these lines is the mother had not realized this connection before, but after her daughter told her that the circumcision argument was the reason that she had left, the mother said, yes, it was the day after that argument that she miscarried. Mm-hmm. So in fact, the mother, I mean, she might have felt some guilt about that. I don't know, because if she thought, well, getting that emotionally, distressed about it, like maybe that somehow caused the miscarriage or whatever, but then to know that, no, it was her daughter's choice, or her son's choice at the time, that became her daughter. And certainly this is not a unique case. I mean, it's unique in the level of detail, but there are a lot of cases out there of children who remember having been miscarried, children who remember having been aborted. They remember that, and a lot of times it was a choice that they made. And other times, it's the mother's choice, and the child who was aborted in a previous life is very understanding of that, because they understand that they can come back in the future, that the mother has decided, no, it's not the right time. And then when the door opens later on, then that same child can come back to you. Mm-hmm. So yeah, there definitely are second chances.
Awesome. Yeah, there's so much evidence that consciousness survives death. Why is it still not commonly accepted in our society? What is your opinion on that?
Well, it's funny because honestly, when you look at the surveys, at least in the US and in the UK, I'm not sure how it is in the German-speaking world, but in the US and the UK, you've got, I think it's somewhere between 60 and 70% of people who believe in life after death. It may even be higher.
Wow.
Belief in life after death is quite common, but it's uncommon for scientists, intellectuals, academics to talk about it. Mm-hmm. Many of them do privately have that belief, but it is taboo to talk about in academic circles. And I think that largely has to do with the fact that it is at odds with the reigning physicalist paradigm that we're working from. And so it doesn't fit in with the rest of our beliefs. It doesn't fit in with the rest of the assumptions that we're basing all of our scientific research on. And so if we're going to talk out loud in public about the idea that life might go on after death, then, well, we're going to have to revise all of these assumptions that we've been working with. We got much bigger questions that we need to deal with. And I think that's a really big challenge. It's not necessarily a project that people are willing to take on. But there's also this fact that it's just taboo. It's seen as sort of a superstitious belief, sort of a holdover from people who, well, if they knew the evidence better, if they understood science, they would know that this isn't possible. But that isn't actually how science works. Science doesn't tell you what's possible and impossible. The more we investigate, the more we realize is possible that we thought was totally impossible. The more new technologies we create, we investigate quantum mechanics and we realize that the structure of the universe is completely different than what we had assumed for centuries. So it's a little irrational that we don't take this seriously, but it's just those dynamics of which thought structures are the most powerful right now in the most important intellectual institutions. And I think that it's going to change. I think little by little, it's starting to change as more people become aware of the evidence that, yeah, it may not fit our current paradigm, but it's still happening. Mm-hmm. And so let's take on the exciting task of figuring out how to change our paradigm so we can not only explain how this stuff is happening, but I think it's going to revolutionize our view of what our physical world really is. And understanding, like we were talking about the, living people having out-of-body experiences. Like if we understand how apparitions of the dead are possible, it's also going to help us understand how these OBE apparitions of living people are possible. Like there's so much more to explore in our world, and it's very exciting.
It is. And that leads me to the next question. If it is really true that consciousness creates matter, what would that mean for us human beings? What would that mean for the collective? But also, how would that affect us as individuals? If that worldview would be accepted commonly, what are the consequences? What do you think?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is people would be a lot more careful about what they think about. because our minds are connected to the matter that we experience. And that's sort of what you were saying, that this physical world is a creation of our consciousness. And we have some influence on the way that the physical world around us changes and moves. And some of that comes out in the coincidences that we experience. Things happen for good or for ill that seem connected to what we've been desiring or what we've been fearing, what we've been thinking about. Those things manifest somehow. And most intellectuals want to just write that off and say, well, that's not really happening. That's just, you're imagining that there's that connection. But if we take seriously the fact that that connection does exist, I think we realize that it can be a hopeful thing and it can be a very sobering thing at the same time, because it means that we do have more power than we realize. We may not know how to channel that. We may not know how to direct it well, but the hopes and desires that we have inside of us, the outside world can respond to those and does often respond to those. So that's a hopeful thing. At the same time, it can be very sobering to realize that what goes on in your mind is that powerful, because sometimes, our minds aren't all love and light. Sometimes we're very angry at ourselves or at other people. And that too seems like it can have physical effects on other people or on the physical world. And so as we realize that connection, we have to be more responsible about the way that we think. You're not only responsible for your actions, but you're responsible for how you think and how you feel, because it does have real effects.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's all mind over matter. That's what a lot of people say. But there is this time period in between our thoughts and the actual manifestation that makes us very uncareful about the things that we think. I mean, for example, imagine we would think elephant and it would appear, we would be much more careful, but it doesn't work like that in our physical world. There's like this time frame that needs to pass on until it appears. So I think we would be much more careful.
Yes. Well, I think too, we have, I think we do have, you know, people looking out for us from the other side. And so I've heard some people talk about physical existence as kind of like a playpen. So, you know, you do have some effects on the world around you, but there's also people sort of protecting you, and you can only go so far in using those abilities, and they're going to intervene to make sure that you don't do things that aren't for your highest good or for the good of other people.
Great. Maybe one last question from my side, at least. In your book, you have mentioned the super psi hypothesis. Would you please explain that?
Yeah, so the super psi hypothesis is sometimes also called the living agent psi hypothesis, because this is an alternative explanation for the third person phenomena of life after death that we experience. So it's an alternative way of explaining apparitions or mediumship or what have you, as being created by the psychic abilities of living people. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, you might see an apparition of your grandmother, and she might tell you something, maybe about something that's going to happen to you in the future. And you take that as evidence. Well, it really was my grandmother. It wasn't just my imagination, because she gave me this information about the future that I couldn't have known. Well, if you understand how living people do have psychic abilities, and often unconscious psychic abilities, you might think to yourself, well, it could be that I was unconsciously accessing this future information, and then my unconscious mind presented it to me as my grandmother telling me this, but it's not necessarily really my grandmother. The living agent psi hypothesis can be used to explain a lot of these third person phenomena. You know, certainly with mediumship, it's invoked a lot, because mediums, obviously, they have a great deal of psychic ability to be able to communicate with people who've crossed over. But why assume that they are communicating with people who've crossed over? Why not? It could be that they're using their psychic abilities to gather all of this information and then put it in the form, you know, communication with your loved one, but they don't really exist anymore. So this is a hypothesis that I think we really have to consider. And this is something that I have considered a lot myself, because none of us want to be deceived. And it is true that the mind has a lot of powers that people don't realize. So is there any evidence that we aren't just creating these illusions ourselves somehow? And I think that the most important piece of evidence is these reciprocal apparitions, these reciprocal dreams, and these intermission memories that often include appearing to someone in a dream or as an apparition. Because when you have somebody who has a memory of having been the apparition, and you can't say, well, it was just an illusion of your grandma. No, your grandma says, no, I remember having been there and talking to you. And two, just the intermission memory phenomenon as a whole, and the near-death experience phenomenon, shows that our consciousness is able to continue on unconnected with the body. And so, yes, while logically it's possible that we could be creating these simulations for ourselves, we have excellent evidence that in many cases, that's not what's going on, that there actually is an enduring consciousness that exists outside of the body and that sometimes remembers communicating with us. So it's an important hypothesis. It's very important to understand it, but I think ultimately the evidence shows that that can't account for all of the cases.
And I think this hypothesis is, again, proving that consciousness somehow survives death, right? Because psychic abilities is not physical. So it again implicates that there is more.
Yeah, well, there are some people who would say, well, it could be that, yes, psychic abilities somehow span time and space, but they can only exist because your brain exists. Like, it's your brain that is being psychic and is connected to the rest of the world. So if your brain dies, then your psychic abilities will die too. Now, I don't think that that's accurate. I think that the evidence shows that that's not the case, because especially with near-death experiences, you have people that come back who were, especially like in the case of Pamela Reynolds, you have a case where people were monitoring her brain activity during this surgery that she was having, and there was no brain activity. There wasn't even a reaction from her brain stem to these loud noises that were being played in her ears. Like, her brain was not reacting whatsoever, and yet she was able to perceive things that were happening in the surgery during that period. Mm-hmm. So once you start accumulating cases like that, it doesn't make sense to say, well, yeah, you're psychic, but it's just your brain cells that are being psychic. And when they die, you won't be psychic anymore.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
We just have to step out of that paradigm completely and say, well, it's not your brain cells, your neurons that are being psychic. It's something much larger that is communicating with your brain. But it's something that's going to endure even when that brain shuts down and doesn't work anymore.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Rawlette, is there anything from your side that you want to share? Anything that you want to tell us about?
I think I would say one more thing about the near-death experiences. It's really important, the cases of people who have had verified perceptions while they didn't have any brain activity. That's super important. But I think it's also really important to listen to other things that near-death experiencers tell us that aren't necessarily, they're not verifiable because they're not observations of the physical world. They're observations of something that happened in some other world, some other dimension. And so, we can't check and make sure that they are right about this. There's no way to verify it. But at the same time, they're privy to this other experience, this other dimension, this other world that most of us haven't been able to experience, or we don't remember experiencing. And the things that they tell us are that it is so different from our life here. And not just so different, but so much more expansive. Like we were saying earlier, you have more senses, there are more colors, there's your perception is more detailed. You can even, as soon as you have a thought or a question in your head, the answer is right there. Or as soon as you think of someone, suddenly you're there with the person. So we've got this verified information from the NDEs, but I think that's kind of like the key that opens the lock. It's like the key that allows us to say, okay, there's something real going on here. This is not just hallucination. So now that we know that, let's listen to what these people are able to tell us about this expanded consciousness. And I think that's where we're going to start to get clues about where our consciousness research should head in the future. We need to get that new paradigm. I think we need to talk to the people who remember having experienced that wider consciousness and use that as our guide.
Yes, I do fully agree. Well, Dr. Rawlette, thank you so much for taking the time and being here with us at Thanatos. Thank you so much for this amazing conversation.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. It's a real pleasure.
Thanks.